You ask what we want with Earth. You assume it is still yours to give.
S4 Facility, Nevada Desert, 2025. Dr. Nolan Vance felt a phantom pressure behind his eyes, a rhythmic thrumming that synchronized his heartbeat to a frequency that shouldn't exist. Subject 7 didn't move. It didn't have limbs to move, but its presence felt like a physical weight, a density of light that made the reinforced concrete walls feel as thin as parchment. The telepathic link wasn't a conversation. It was a violent overwriting of his consciousness, a cold clinical intrusion that stripped away his ego. In that shimmering silence, Nolan realized with a sickening lurch of his stomach that he wasn't a diplomat meeting an ambassador. He was a microbe under a lens, looking up at a landlord who had just checked the expiration date on the lease and found it had already passed. The drive toward the horizon felt less like a journey, and more like a retreat. As Nolan's Tahoe hummed along the sun-bleached asphalt, the revelation from Subject 7 began to settle into his bones, cold and heavy as lead. For 40 years, the scientific community, and Nolan himself, had obsessed over the Fermi Paradox. They had asked, with a mixture of hope and arrogance, "Where is everybody?" They had built giant radio ears to listen for a whisper, a song, or even a threat. But as the entity's overwritten thoughts echoed in his skull, Nolan finally understood the punchline to the universe's cruelest joke. The silence wasn't a mystery. It was a survival strategy. The steering wheel of the 1998 Chevy Tahoe felt strangely light in Nolan's hands, as if it were made of balsa wood. As he drove away from the nondescript gate of the S4 facility, the Nevada desert stretched out before him, a vast expanse of ochre and dust that had been his backyard for 40 years. But today, the Joshua trees didn't look like plants. They looked like jagged, desperate sculptures reaching for a sky that had suddenly turned hostile. The sun, once a source of warmth, now felt like a spotlight in a laboratory, illuminating a petri dish that was about to be bleached clean. Nolan pulled over to the side of the road, the gravel crunching beneath his tires with a sound that seemed deafening in the vacuum of his mind. He looked in the rearview mirror at a face he barely recognized. 72 years of wrinkles, etched by decades of classified boredom and punctuated by moments of soul-crushing terror. He remembered the day he was recruited in 1985, a young, arrogant exolinguist who thought he could decode the language of the stars. He had spent half a lifetime staring at static, waiting for a signal, only to realize that the silence of the universe wasn't a lack of life. It was a calculated, terrifying quarantine. At the base, the routine had been his anchor. The daily security sweeps, the lukewarm coffee in the mess hall, the endless hours spent in the whisper room trying to find a syntax in the humming of Subject 7. He had sacrificed marriages, a daughter's childhood, and his own sanity for the privilege of being the first to know. And now, he wished he had died in total ignorance. Subject 7 hadn't used words. It had projected a feeling of utility concluded. To them, humanity wasn't a civilization to be greeted. It was a biological film that had grown over a valuable resource. The experiment was the evolution of the planet itself, and humanity was merely the unintended mold growing on the side of the glass. He looked back at the facility in the distance, a tiny speck against the mountains. Inside that vault, the entity remained, waiting for the cleanup crew to arrive from the void. Nolan realized that his career hadn't been about discovery. It had been about documenting the final moments of a doomed colony. The silence of the desert felt heavier now, echoing the silence of the galaxy, a zone where no one speaks because they don't want to be noticed by the doctors. The universe was teeming with life, but it was a life of absolute, terrifying order. Subject 7 had projected a map into Nolan's mind, but it wasn't a map of stars or galaxies. It was a schematic of containment zones. In the grand ecology of the cosmos, high-intelligent civilizations didn't look for friends. They looked for anomalies. They were the gardeners of reality, and Earth was a patch of soil that had developed a particularly aggressive weed, humanity. Nolan remembered the sensation of the entity's mind touching his, a feeling of being brushed by a mountain. It had shown him the great silence from their perspective. To the others, the radio waves humanity had been pumping out for a century weren't a greeting. They were the alarm bells of an infection. We were a species that had mastered the atom before we had mastered ourselves, a volatile biological hazard that had begun to leak out of its designated container. The quarantine wasn't a wall built around Earth. It was an agreement among the elder races to ignore us until we either burned ourselves out or became significant enough to require sanitization. We are the caretakers, the entity had pulsed into his consciousness, the thought vibrating through his teeth. You are the byproduct. The experiment was intended to see if carbon-based intelligence could achieve equilibrium without external intervention. You failed. Nolan gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. He thought of all the SETI researchers, the dreamers who looked at the stars and saw hope. They thought the lack of contact was due to the vastness of space or the limitations of technology. They never imagined that the rest of the galaxy was holding its breath, waiting for the Earth project to be shut down. The entity had described the Earth as a petri dish with a cracked lid. For eons, the caretakers had watched as the planet underwent 5 mass extinctions, each one a controlled reset designed to steer the experiment back on track. But the 6th extinction, the one currently unfolding, was different. This one was being caused by the experiment itself. Humanity had become a runaway reaction. Nolan pulled the car onto a dirt turnout and stared out at the shimmering heat waves rising from the salt flats. He remembered a specific classified file from the 1990s, the signal from the Buddha's void. They had thought it was a pulsar, a natural phenomenon. Now, through the lens of the entity's warning, he realized it was a boundary marker, a celestial keep out sign. The reason the Buddha's void was so empty wasn't because of a lack of matter, but because it was a cordon sanitaire. Entire galactic sectors had been scrubbed clean of life that had refused to follow the universal order. The warning, Nolan whispered to the empty car, his voice cracking. It wasn't for us. It was about us. The entity had made it clear 2025 was the deadline, the year of evaluation. The landlords were returning to see if the tenants had maintained the property. And as Nolan looked at the scarred landscape of the desert, the test sites for nuclear weapons, the encroaching urban sprawl, the drying lakes, he knew the verdict was already written. We weren't being invited to join a galactic federation. We were being assessed for removal. The psychological weight of this knowledge began to tear at the seams of his mind. How do you go home to a wife and tell her the sun is just a heat lamp in a lab? How do you look at a grandchild and know they are nothing more than an unintended mutation in a failed study? The warning that broke him wasn't about a fleet of ships coming to glass the planet. It was the realization that in the eyes of the universe, we were never people. We were a chemical smear on a rock that had lasted slightly longer than expected. Nolan reached for a cigarette, his hands shaking. He hadn't smoked in 20 years, but the rules didn't seem to matter much anymore. As he lit it, he thought about the Great Filter. Scientists hypothesized that there was a barrier that prevented civilizations from becoming interstellar. They thought it was something we had to overcome. They were wrong. The Great Filter wasn't a natural hurdle, it was a security protocol. The entity had shown him images of other failed dishes, worlds that looked like Earth, once vibrant and blue, now reduced to smooth, gray spheres of sterile dust. There were no ruins, no monuments to the fallen. The caretakers were thorough. They didn't just kill, they deleted. They removed the evidence of the infection to make room for the next experiment. Why tell me? Nolan had screamed in his mind during those final seconds in the vault. Why let me know? The entity's response was a final, chilling pulse of telepathic irony. The specimen should always be aware when the observation period has ended. It is the final data point. Nolan found himself driving toward a small, forgotten ghost town called Niala. It was little more than a collection of skeletal wooden frames and rusted machinery, a place that had died long ago when the silver ran out. It felt appropriate. As the sun began to dip toward the jagged teeth of the horizon, casting long, bruised shadows across the salt flats, Nolan pulled up to a collapsed general store. He stepped out, the dry heat of the desert replaced by a sudden, biting chill. He wasn't here to hide. He was here to record. If the specimen was to be erased, Nolan felt a primal, stubborn need to leave a scratch on the glass of the Petri dish before it was shattered. He pulled a heavy leather-bound journal from his glove box, a relic of his younger years when he still believed that ink and paper held more permanence than digital bits. His hands, spotted with age and trembling with a cocktail of adrenaline and despair, fumbled with a fountain pen. He began to write, not as a scientist but as a witness. The entity, Subject 7, did not use the word evil, he wrote, the ink bleeding slightly into the grain of the paper. In their moral calculus, evil does not exist. There is only efficiency and waste. We have become the latter. He paused, looking up at the sky. The first few stars were beginning to prick through the violet canopy. For decades, he had looked at those stars with a sense of wonder. Now, they looked like eyes. Thousands of cold, unblinking eyes watching a tragedy they had seen 1,000,000 times before. He began to detail the logistics of the end as he had glimpsed them in the telepathic torrent. The entity hadn't described an invasion. There would be no towering tripods, no beams of green light leveling cities, no cinematic struggle for survival. Those were human fantasies, projections of our own violent history. The reality was much more surgical. The sanitization, Nolan wrote, is a change in fundamental constants. They don't need to fire a shot. They simply adjust the frequency of the magnetosphere, or perhaps introduce a catalyst into the upper atmosphere that renders organic bonds unstable. It is not an act of war. It is an act of maintenance, like a technician changing a burnt-out bulb. He thought back to the images Subject 7 had seared into his mind, the archive of the condemned. He had seen flashes of other species. Some were beautiful, crystalline beings that lived in the atmospheres of gas giants. Others were hive minds that had spanned entire moons. All of them had been pruned. The common thread wasn't a lack of intelligence. It was a lack of restraint. Every species that had reached for the stars without first taming the chaos of their own nature had been flagged as a contaminant. Nolan realized that the Great Silence was a filter for character, not just technology. The universe wasn't empty because life was rare. It was empty because wisdom was rare. And the caretakers had no patience for the foolish. "We thought we were special because we were alone," he scribbled, his handwriting becoming more frantic, more jagged. "We interpreted the silence as a canvas for our own manifest destiny. We didn't realize it was a warning. We are a child playing with a loaded gun in a library, and the librarian has finally reached for the keys to the room." A sudden sound, the dry rattle of a Mojave green rattlesnake, made him jump. He looked down and saw the serpent coiled near a rotted timber. In the past, he would have stepped back in fear. Now, he felt a strange, heartbreaking kinship with it. Both of them were about to be deleted. Both of them were part of an experiment that had been deemed a failure, not because of the snake, but because of the man. He began to write about the quarantine zone again. He recalled the entity showing him the edge. It wasn't a physical wall, but a gravitational shear at the edge of the Oort cloud. Anything that crossed it without the signature of equilibrium was simply dismantled at the atomic level. Humanity had been trying to send probes out, trying to scream into the void, never realizing we were banging on the walls of a high-security ward. "They don't hate us," Nolan wrote, a tear finally escaping and smudging the word hate. "That is the hardest part to swallow. You do not hate the ants you wash off your porch with a hose. You just want the porch clean. Our art, our music, our wars, our religions, to them, it is all just the buzzing of an agitated hive. It has no meaning. It has no weight." He thought of the S4 facility, only a few dozen miles away. Right now, the generals and the politicians would be scrambling, trying to figure out how to weaponize the information Nolan had extracted. They would be talking about defense budgets, nuclear deterrence, and galactic sovereignty. They were still playing the game of kings on a board that was being folded up and put away. "The warning broke me," he wrote, echoing the thought that had been circling his consciousness since he left the vault. "It broke me because it stripped away the last delusion of human importance. We are not the protagonists of this story. We are a footnote in a lab report that is about to be filed under failed transitions." He looked at his watch. The time seemed to be moving differently now, stretching and compressing as his mind struggled to process the scale of the impending erasure. He wondered if anyone else had been given the message. Were there other Nolans in Russia, in China, in underground bunkers in the Andes, all sitting in the dark, clutching journals, waiting for the sky to change? He stood up, his knees popping, and walked to the edge of the town's main street. The desert was silent, save for the wind. It was a peaceful silence, the kind that precedes a deep, dreamless sleep. He realized that his fear had been replaced by a profound, hollowed-out exhaustion. He was tired of the secrets, tired of the lies, tired of being the only cell in the body that knew the heart was about to stop. "If anyone finds this," he wrote on the final page of the journal, "do not look to the stars for help. Look at each other. The only thing that was ever real was the person standing next to you. The caretakers do not value love or mercy or beauty. They value order. And in their quest for order, they have missed the only thing that made the experiment worth running." He closed the book and placed it inside a rusted iron safe that sat in the corner of the general store. He didn't lock it. He simply pushed the door shut, leaving the archive of the condemned to wait for a future that might never come. The first sign wasn't a flash of light or a thunderous roar. It was a subtle, terrifying shift in the fundamental texture of reality. Sitting in the dark cabin of his Tahoe, Nolan noticed that the digital clock on his dashboard had stopped flickering. The red numbers, 4:44 p.m., didn't just freeze, they began to bleed, the light stretching into long, luminous threads that ignored the boundaries of the plastic screen. Nolan stepped out of the car, his boots hitting the salt crust with a sound that was no longer a crunch, but a low-frequency hum. The sanitization had begun. It started with the colors. The deep indigo of the Nevada twilight was being systematically replaced by a hue that Nolan's human eyes struggled to categorize, a shimmering anti-white that felt like it was being poured directly into his brain. It wasn't that the world was being destroyed, it was being uninstalled. He looked down at his hands. They were becoming translucent, the veins glowing with the same eerie radiance he had seen within Subject 7. He wasn't in pain. Instead, he felt a strange, detached lightness, as if the gravity of his own history was finally being lifted. The landlords were adjusting the constants of the local space-time, shifting the frequency of the Earth's matter just enough to decouple it from the physical plane. In the distance, the mountains began to blur at the edges, dissolving into geometric fractals. Nolan realized then that the entity hadn't lied about Earth's true purpose. It wasn't just a petri dish. It was a data-harvesting node. Every scrap of biological data, every evolution of DNA, every thought ever thought by a human being had been recorded as a variable in a massive cosmic calculation. Now that the experiment had reached its terminal point, the caretakers were simply hitting save before deleting the temporary files. "The verdict is in," Nolan whispered, but he could no longer hear his own voice. The air was too thin, the vibrations too high. Suddenly, his mind was flooded with a final, panoramic vision, the true Earth. He saw the planet not as a rock in space, but as a complex, multi-dimensional circuit. He saw the ley lines of energy that the ancients had whispered about, now glowing like fiber-optic cables. He saw the collective consciousness of humanity, the noosphere, rising like a plume of smoke from the surface, being drawn upward into a massive, invisible siphon. They were taking the results. All the suffering, the art, the wars, and the love were being compressed into a single stream of information to be analyzed in some distant, higher dimensional laboratory. We were never meant to survive the harvest. We were the crop, and the harvest was finally here. Nolan looked up at the sky one last time. The stars were gone. In their place was a vast, shimmering grid that spanned the entire horizon, a celestial sieve designed to catch the essence of the planet while the physical dross was discarded. He saw a massive shape, larger than the moon, descending with the silent, terrifying grace of a falling snowflake. It was the Cleaner, a vessel of pure geometry and absolute purpose. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of regret, not for his life and not even for the end of the world, but for the sheer magnificent waste of it all. To be so close to the truth and to have it mean absolutely nothing. To know the secrets of the gods only to realize that the gods were just high-level bureaucrats. We were beautiful, Nolan thought, projecting the sentiment with every ounce of his remaining willpower, hoping it would be caught in the harvest. We were flawed, and we were violent, but we were felt. The light intensified, becoming a blinding, all-consuming roar of silence. The desert, the ghost town of Nyala, the Tahoe, and the journal in the safe, everything began to vibrate at the frequency of the void. Nolan felt his atoms beginning to drift apart, the bonds of his physical self surrendering to the new laws of the room. In the final microsecond of his existence, Dr. Nolan Vance didn't feel like a broken man. He felt like a completed sentence. The warning hadn't just broken him, it had emptied him, making room for the ultimate truth of the cosmos. The Earth didn't end with a bang or a whimper, it ended with a selection. As the Cleaner touched the atmosphere, the planet Earth blinked out of the visible spectrum. To an outside observer in the solar system, it would have appeared as if the third planet from the sun simply vanished, leaving behind nothing but a perfectly sterile orbit and a faint lingering echo of a billion screams that were never meant to be heard. The experiment was over. The lab was dark. And somewhere in the infinite cold of the Boda's void, a technician began the setup for the next dish.